There we are. What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Lab 3 for AMP2 in the winter course. And it is on the beginning of the nervous system. So now we start to combine what we're talking about in lecture with what we're talking about in lab, which is wonderful because everything I'm saying is going to correlate with everything else. In this lab, Lab 3, Um, we are going to talk primarily about a neuron, which we should have at this point already covered in lecture. I'll talk about the parts, kind of how they work. We're going to talk about the spinal cord in some detail. We're also going to include in that the nerves, um, which I should probably have on here, and recognizing some basic nerves throughout the body. And we will have a little bit of histology. And obviously in lab now that we've done the first two, which were more kind of physiology review-ish based, now we're going to dive into some gross anatomy. You'll be utilizing the real anatomy linked on your Blackboard. You have access to the whole thing. Your homework assignments will be on there to complete. Um, Obviously, you must do them by the allotted time. And let's get started. First off, we have the term nerve. So a nerve, as you can see at the top, is a group of neurons. A neuron is the cell of the nervous system. On the next slide, I'm going to describe to you what a neuron is, but it's important to recognize that we have spinal nerves. In this section, we're going to be talking a lot about spinal nerves. Obviously, they are nerves that branch off the spinal cord by definition. These nerves are mixed, and we will talk a little bit about that if we have not already talked about it in lecture. And that means that these nerves carry messages for both sensory and motor information, and that is important. But a nerve is made up of a whole bunch of neurons. So it's just a group. The neuron is the cell that is either sending a message to or from the central nervous system. And here we can see we group those together, right? And then we group those together, and then you get your nerve. The outer covering, which I'm sure I've already covered in lecture, is called an epineurium, right? Obviously, we have these fascicles, which are just groups of axons or groups of neurons, and that's covered by the perineurium. And then the cover itself around a axon is called the endoneurium. So we have basically these connective tissue layers that separate each substructure. Big picture, mixed carry sensory and motor messages. Yay. You want to have a nerve that carries messages to and from. It's more efficient that way, saves space, just like a highway. One way is going to take you north, the other way is going to take you south. They run parallel to each other. So that is what a spinal nerve is. And let's dive into a neuron. A lot going on here, right? One, you can see the histology slide of a neuron. It shows you what the cell body is, a dendrite branching off that cell body, and respectively an axon. So if I just slide this out of the way here, the first thing I want to talk about is the cell body. The cell body of a neuron is the hub, right? Obviously, it contains the nucleus, right? Important. This neuron's going to have some shape, right? That's what those neurofibrils do, but you don't have to stress about that. Within this cell body, we also have these little structures that I'll show you on the model called Niesel bodies. In lecture, we've discussed the function of them. They're little patches of rough ER. They're responsible for synthesizing proteins and things like that that are very important. Obviously, we have the cytoplasm, which is just the inside of the cell. So key ones right now, cell body, And off the cell body, we have these branches. These branches are called dendrites. They increase the surface area of that cell body so they can communicate with many different neurons, as probably discussed at this point. This is clearly a motor neuron. We're going to talk about why. But this cell body is receiving tons of information, or not sending it from the cell body, but having those dendritic processes is very important. But this neuron has to send a message. That's the big picture. It sends action potentials. That's what they do. And the point at which the neuron decides whether or not it sends a message, obviously, is determined by reaching threshold, etc., the electrical activity at that membrane. That point is the axon hillock. So the axon hillock is or hillock is the point where if threshold is reached, the message is sent. If it's not, the message is not sent. Where does it send a message? It sends the message through the axon. So the axon is a very, very important part, respectively, of the neuron. That is the arm that is reaching out, that is going to send the message along the distance, and sometimes 3 feet. I don't know, depends. So the axon is important. Specifically on a motor neuron and some sensory neurons, we have a covering. The covering is called the myelin sheath. The point of this, hopefully as described already, is to speed up messages, right? Again, in lab, we're more talking about the structures. And obviously that neurolemma is the membrane of the neuron. It's the plasma membrane, right? And that myelin sheath covers, and the myelin sheath is produced by something called a Schwann cell. So this is the Schwann cell here. That's kind of the nucleus of it, right? You can see that there. So cell body, dendrites, axon hillock. Axon, and in this case, is covered by a myelin sheath. And an important thing about that myelin sheath is there's areas that are not myelinated. And we call those nodes of Ranvier. The nodes are unmyelinated patches where this depolarization occurs. Depolarization, depolarization, right? Allowing, obviously inside and outside, allowing that message to jump, if you will, from section to section. If I could just get rid of that. So everything I'm highlighting here are the key points to this neuron, and I will label it for you, obviously, on a picture in a second. Other than that, at the end of the neuron, we have these little synaptic knob guys. We call them synaptic end bulbs. The key with those is that they store neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters will be released, respectively, and they will cause something to happen. Maybe they inhibit a neuron, or maybe they promote depolarization of a neuron, and that is the gist. So on this picture, probably on your test, maybe show you this picture because I like it, and ask you what some of these structures are. Here we can see the cell body. We can see some dendrites branching off the cell body. We can see the nucleus, right? And I'm not going to go through and label this for you, but if you want, print this out, practice it, look at this PowerPoint slide, go on your iPad or computer, whatever, practice labeling things. We can also see the axon hillock, which is located right here. We can also see the Niesel bodies, which are found here in blue. And this is the axon projecting off the cell body. We can visualize this part connecting to this part up here, right? Because it's kind of broken because the model's split in half. And then this thing over here is our axon. important things that we mentioned about the axon. We have the myelin sheath, which you can see is that coating surrounding the axon. We have the Schwann cell, specifically the nucleus of the Schwann cell, because it's the easiest thing to see. And that Schwann cell, again, makes that myelin sheath. And we can also see the node of Ranvier. I know it's probably not the best color, but that is all good. Node of Ranvier, as well as the endoneurium. And that endoneurium, again, is that cover that surrounds the axon. I probably won't ask you that, but that's what it is. So cell body, axon hillock, dendritic projections, the axon, myelin sheath, Schwann cell, node of Ranvier. Be familiar with that, be able to recognize the structures. Obviously, in lecture, we already talked about what they do. And that's your basic neuron. Everything in the nervous system is made up of neurons, minus a few neuroglial cells, including the spinal cord. So this slide right here kind of gives you some important terminology that you should be familiar with, kind of a list, if you will, of things to know. And I'm going to show it to you. When we look at the spinal cord, obviously, it's part of the central nervous system. It's made of a ton of neurons just densely packed together. Obviously, it runs from your brain all the way down to the lumbar sacral region. But we can see, looking at this, it's made of two different colors, right? We have on here the gray matter, which is darker, looks like a butterfly. And this picture is found towards the inside. And towards the outside, we have white matter. And the white matter is clearly lighter in color, right? The gray matter, if you recall, is made primarily of cell bodies. The white matter's made more of axons, myelinated axons, and things like that. And we'll see when we look at the picture what the significance of that is. So, what do I want you to know? And I'll show you on some other pictures as well. The gray matter has horns. So I'll try to color code this for you. We have a horn in the back of the spinal cord, and I'll tell you how you can tell the difference between the front and the back. It's called the posterior gray horn. We have an anterior gray horn, which is the horn found in the front. And we have a lateral gray horn, which are these small guys sticking off the side in the middle. One way to tell the front from back of the spinal cord is usually this anterior horn is bigger, right? We can see that up here on this picture. Sometimes the histology slides get a little smushed, but for the most part, the anterior horn is going to be bigger. And the posterior horn, in most situations, comes really close to the back, right? So sometimes you'll even see it touching. And I'll show you some pictures on that. The white matter, I'll try to not do yellow because it's going to be hard to see. Let's go red. The white matter is not made of horns. It is made of columns. So the white matter in the spinal cord is the anterior white column, or you can call it the anterior column. You have the lateral columns, or lateral white columns. And you have the posterior columns, which are found towards the back, right? This would be your lateral. So the main difference is you have gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is made of horns. You should be able to tell by looking at a spinal cord if it's the front or the back, right? I'll give you a couple other pointers real quick, just because we're here. If you look at the front of the spinal cord, there's kind of a big gap there. It has a name. I'll teach it to you in a second. And then the posterior aspect of the spinal cord has a thinner opening. That thinner opening is called the posterior median sulcus. That big opening in the front is called the anterior median fissure. And We might have talked about this in lecture. You do need to know these structures. You have to know them all. You have to be able to recognize them. There's a few more that I'm going to add in. Then I'll erase this so you could get a little bit clearer of an image. The bridge in between both wings of the butterfly, if you will, the bridge in between both sides of gray matter is called the gray commissure, and that is the bridge. Found inside there, which is a little bit hard to see because I scribbled all over the picture. Maybe we'll do it in purple. There's a little hole. This hole will be significant. It's filled with CSF, which we will discuss. I've already discussed it in lecture, probably. We will talk about it when we go into the brain, cerebral spinal fluid. But that little hole in the middle is called the central canal. So you can also utilize this picture up here to see it more cartoony. Big picture, we have gray matter. It has specific horns, be able to recognize the anterior, posterior, and lateral. The white matter, which surrounds the outside of the spinal cord, is made of columns, right, respectively an anterior, lateral, and posterior column. In those columns, we're going to have neurons that are running up and down the spinal cord. Those are called tracts. Maybe we'll get to that. Not probably in the lab, but we'll definitely talk about it in lecture if we already didn't. Oh, no, we will, but it's going to be in 2 labs from now. Be familiar with the parts. I'm going to erase this. So you have a little bit clearer of a picture of what that stuff is pointing to. And I'm going to highlight some of these structures on this model, right? So I look at this, okay, maybe the anterior horn on this picture isn't quite as big as it was on the previous one. But one thing I can use to figure out what's what is the fact that these horns are pointing towards the back. So when we look at a picture like this, right, we could see those horns are pointing towards the back. We could see that there's a slightly larger gap in the front. And we'll come back to here, right? Obviously, I'll draw lines so you can practice. We have our anterior horns, posterior horns, lateral horns. We have our gray commissure, which is in the middle. We have our central canal, right? Practicing all this. We have different regions of white matter, which are called columns. Our anterior, posterior, and lateral ones, respectively. And then we can see our anterior median fissure and posterior median sulcus. Fissure is bigger, a sulcus is smaller. And in the next lab, when we go over the brain, we will see plenty of fissures and sulci in the brain, and we'll discuss it. So in general, these are the basic parts of a spinal cord. The gray matter is made of cell bodies. That's why it's darker, because the nuclei are darker. And the white matter primarily is made of myelinated axons. As we transition, we started off mentioning spinal nerves. Spinal nerves branch off the spinal cord. The previous picture didn't show these nerves branching off. That's why I started with it, to keep it nice and simple. But what you will notice is coming off of these spinal cord regions, you have a tube in the front and a tube in the back, and then it fuses with the nerve. These nerves are your spinal nerves, right? So if you look up here, let's see if you could even see it. Not the best picture. I'll show you on another one. These are called roots. So I will show you on the next picture. What we're looking at. And this is our spinal nerve. This is our spinal nerve. These are all spinal nerves. And the nerves branch off the spinal cord, but we know a spinal nerve is mixed. So what we have coming into and I'll try to color code it for you. What we have coming into the back of the spinal cord are a group of sensory neurons. Another way, if I show you this picture, to tell the back from front is this thing. It's called the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a group of cell bodies, and this tells me that this is the back of the spinal cord. So these are all sensory neurons coming in here. They're going to synapse with some motor stuff over here. And then our motor messages will be leaving out the front. So these areas, respectively, are called ventral roots, right, for the front. And they are called dorsal roots for the back. Not the best color, but I'll write for you here. These are sensory. And these are motor neurons, respectively. Obviously, we have already seen the spinal cord and all the different parts within the dense body of spinal cord. And now we elaborated to show you the spinal nerves, which are highlighted in red, sensory messages coming in the back through the dorsal root ganglion and that dorsal root. Obviously, there will be lots of synapsing and things happening here, right? And then those motor messages come out. Sometimes those sensory messages get sent up to the brain to be analyzed. And sometimes we'll have a reflex where the message will just come in and it'll go out. But in general, motor in the front, sensory in the back, and then our spinal nerves, which we discussed, are mixed, which makes sense. They have sensory and motor messages traveling through them. That's the basic spinal cord. So you got your neuron, basic unit of the nervous system. You got your spinal cord. You have a couple different parts of it. You should recognize that anatomy. And now you have meninges. So this is the first time that we're talking about it in lab. And this kind of highlights some of it, but I'll go to my model and I'll show you. These meninges are made of a few different matters. Let's see. It doesn't talk about all of it here. It talks about some of them, but I'm going to highlight what I want you to know. The meninges are layers that surround the central nervous system. In this case, we're just talking about the spinal cord, right? So the way I remember it is, maybe I'll do it over here. Dura matter, arachnoid matter, and pia matter. These are the three layers, right? You can see dura matter and arachnoid matter here, and I'll show you kind of the difference. And inside and outside of these layers, or meninges, we have spaces. So we'll just slide that out of the way. Outside of the dura matter, we will have a epidural space. We will have a subdural space. And underneath the arachnoid matter, we will have a subarachnoid space. Sorry, trying to write really small. So we have three layers, the dura matter, the arachnoid matter, and the pia matter. And then we have spaces. The epidural space is on the outside. The subdural space is between the dura matter and the arachnoid matter. And the subarachnoid space, which is super important. So I'm going to put a star next to it, is the larger space underneath the arachnoid matter before we get to the pia matter. So obviously everything else labeled on here, your dorsal roots, your posterior roots. The main difference with this picture is it's not just showing you a spinal cord, it's showing you a spinal cord within a vertebrae, right? That's what it actually looks like. So this is the model. First thing I want you to recognize is front from back. This is the back. We can see that. We can see the spinous process of the vertebrae. We could see these larger horns towards the front, smaller horns towards the back. We could see that big opening in the front, smaller opening in the back, right? But we've already talked about the spinal cord. On this picture, I want to highlight a few things. Our spinal nerve, our dorsal root ganglion. These messages are coming into the back, and respectively, the motor messages are coming out of the front, both of which, right, fusing into that spinal nerve, and we can see our meninges. I will only highlight the ones you can see pretty good. And that first one is the epidural space. That is the yellow part. This epidural space, right? We can see it's kind of got some blood vessels in it. It's yellow, it's fatty. We'll talk about the significance of that in lecture, obviously. And then you have this very crammed region. I don't know what color to pick. Maybe I'll do it in red. Right here. Within that region, you can see there's this white layer. That is the dura mater. Then, and I can't ask you this because it's very, very small. Maybe I'll just ask you a question. Multiple choice, maybe. You have the subdural space. It's that faint, and I'm not even going to try to draw it, but that faint dark space in between the white and the white, or the gray and the gray, kind of. And then you have the arachnoid matter. Obviously, in between there would be the subdural space. But the key thing is, here you see that you have a large gap. Maybe that's not the best color. Large gap. All of this is subarachnoid space. Everything in here. It is filled with CSF. It's filled with the fluid. It's important. So clearly, epidural space is easy to ask you. The other ones are kind of harder. And clearly, that subarachnoid space is easy to ask you. Just the bigger structures, right? And then if you look inside, you will see our innermost layer, which is white. And that is our pia mater. So on here, I highlighted it blue. Right, that's our pia. And the orange was our subarachnoid space. So I introduced the three layers of the meninges. Some are easier to see than others, as well as the spaces on the outside, middle, and inside of these meninges that surround the CSF. Specifically here, the meninges that surround the spinal cord, right? You can see, obviously, epidural space up here as well. And we also reviewed that spinal nerve and the sensory coming in the back via the dorsal root ganglion and the motor coming out the front. Hopefully that makes sense. Try to keep it pretty straightforward. Know your neuron, know your spinal cord anatomy, know the branches coming in and out. and know the meninges. But again, I can only ask you a couple of them, right? Unless I have a different picture. What we have here is a list of structures, specifically nerves, spinal nerves, as well as certain areas of the actual spinal cord. So when I look at this picture, I'm not looking at a cross section of the spinal cord. I'm looking at the whole thing in a human body, right? And you'll see real anatomy pictures of this, and you should be able to recognize them, right? You use it as a tool. That's what your quiz is going to be on, or your homeworks. So it looks like there's a lot. I'm going to simplify it for you, right? The spinal cord, just like your spine, is broken into a few sections. We have a cervical region, we have a thoracic region, we have a lumbar region, we have a sacral region. You'll notice that there are branches coming off this spinal cord, and they're in groups. So the first thing I want you to know is that groups of spinal nerves coming off the spinal cord are called plexuses, or a plexus. The first plexus is coming off the cervical region, called the cervical plexus, right? So there's certain nerves that branch off those, respectively. The cervical plexus is the group of spinal nerves that branches off the cervical region. We have another plexus called the brachial plexus. And the brachial plexus is what's going to branch off some of the cervical, some of the thoracic, and it's going to run down the arm. Brachial refers to the arm. So if you have a group of nerves branching off the spinal cord going down the arm, they are part of the brachial plexus. In this middle region, we don't have a plexus. We just have nerves. Not necessarily a group, right? We call them thoracic nerves. When I show you the picture in a minute, we're going to see what the name of those nerves are. They run to the intercostals. So that's just a generalized region, not necessarily a plexus. As we work our way down, we have a lumbar region, right? Lower lumbar. So we're going to have nerves that branch off. That group of nerves is called the lumbar plexus. And as we get down to the bottom, we have a sacral plexus, obviously made of sacral spinal nerves. The lumbar plexus is made of lumbar spinal nerves. Some of these nerves have names. I'm going to teach them to you. So looking at the generalized picture, each area of the spinal cord has groups branching off of it, and they're called plexuses. The plexus I want you to know are the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. We do not have a thoracic plexus. We just have thoracic nerves, right? And lastly, on this picture, you will see that there is a few parts that have specific names. You will see coming downwards towards that blue line that I drew, it is a dense spinal cord. At this point, there's a little cone-like formation called the conus medullaris. That cone-like formation is important. It's called the conus medullaris, and you should be able to recognize it. Hanging off this region are groups of spinal nerves we just discussed, and this area or unit of hanging spinal nerves is called the cauda equina. So those are two specific structures. On the next couple pictures, I'll show you where they are on some of the pictures that we have that are a little bit more clear, most of them. So big picture, regions of the spinal cord, plexus, and the two structures specifically conus medullaris, and cauda equina. Hopefully that makes sense. Now we have to name the nerves. There's not as many nerves as there are blood vessels, so I'm going to stick to the big ones, right? Let's see, looking through here. One of them will be the axillary nerve. Obviously, this is all the brachial plexus, right? There's only one nerve I'll teach you in the cervical. It's the phrenic. But that brachial plexus is going down the arm. The first nerve is the axillary nerve. The axillary nerve innervates your deltoid. It's important, right? The musculocutaneous is going to innervate the bicep. The radial innervates more posterior regions. The median is in the middle, and the ulnar is towards the medial side, right? These are the nerves I want you to focus on. If I ask you, I will ask you in a clear area where we can see the difference, right? The axillary is always going to be in the shoulder. The musculocutaneous is always going to be by the bicep. The radial is always going to be by the thumb side. The median's always going to be by the pinky side. I'm sorry, the ulnar's always going to be by the pinky side, and the median's always going to be in the middle, right? So let's take a look at, right? You can see here, radial thumb side. Let's take a look at some of the pictures. This picture is looking at the neck and arm region, right? This is a big model. We just took a picture of it. So what I want you to know here, cervical plexus. Here, brachial plexus. This is showing the groups of nerves branching off the cervical and cervical thoracic regions. Makes sense. This is obviously going to go down your arm. This is in the neck region. Makes sense, right? Now, at the bottom of this picture, it connects to here. So what they did is they turned this picture sideways so we could fit it on here. So this is your spinal cord coming down. These are your thoracic nerves. Specifically, they are called intercostal nerves. They innervate the intercostal muscles in between your ribs. Makes sense. What else can we see on here? You can see that conus medullaris. We can also see that cauda equina, those groups of nerves hanging down. In this area, you will be able to identify, that's a horrible line, the lumbar and the sacral plexuses. Right. I will show you a different picture where we could clearly see the nerves a little bit better. But this is, again, if you kind of just turn this picture, this is looking at the thoracic region, the lumbar, and the sacral region of the spinal cord. Talked about this. And here we have a slightly different picture. Cervical plexus, brachial plexus, intercostal nerves. And this model is really good to see the nerves, right? This is our axillary nerve, as we said it was going to be by the deltoid. And that's pretty much what we could see on this picture, right? Cervical plexus, brachial, intercostal nerve, and axillary. Right. Cool. Next time we have lab, we go over this part, which is crazy. Same model, working our way down. We can see the intercostal nerves. We can see the brachial plexus. We can see the axillary nerves. But now we can see this one, which is the musculocutaneous nerve. It's by the bicep, right? We can also kind of see it poking through over here. So I'll get rid of all the stuff we already labeled so it doesn't confuse you. The new one on this picture is the musculocutaneous nerve. And we can see that conus medullaris and all the other ones that we already learned on the previous picture. Working our way down, and I like this picture because we can see the thumb side, which will be the radial nerve. We can see the pinky side, which will be the ulnar nerve. And we can see the middle, which will be our median. Makes sense. They're in the arm. I like to visualize them here. Obviously, we could also see them up more towards the top. Here, I'm going to show you something that allows us to differentiate. This big guy that runs down is our sciatic nerve. So you can see it comes up. This is the sacral region. I remember sciatic, sacral, SS. That is our sacral region. Above it is our lumbar region, aka our lumbar plexus. So this one is the sciatic nerve. This one is something called the obturator nerve, which I'll show you in 2 seconds because I'll pull up the slide. And this one is our femoral nerve. So this picture is mainly to highlight the arm, labeled the radial, ulnar, and medial nerve respectively. However, I can see it on here. So I want to preface what we're going to go over in the next slide. And these are some of the nerves that branch off in the lower body, right? Lumbar region, sacral region. So obviously this femoral nerve branches off the lumbar. The sciatic branches off the sacral. And here we can see some of those nerves that I just highlighted. Femoral nerve, sciatic nerve, and obturator nerve. Makes sense. As we work our way down the leg, so you can see there's a couple nerves, but it's not super crazy. As we work our way down the leg, we will see a tibial nerve, a fibular nerve, and a plantar nerve. And when we show the picture of the leg, I will show you where those are. The tibia is always going to be medial. The fibular is always going to be lateral. And the plantar is always going to be in the foot. So when we look at this image, we can see, I'll do it in red, the fibular nerve will be off to the side. You don't have to worry about common, superficial, and deep fibular and stuff like that. The tibial nerve will always be towards the middle. Fibular nerve always off to the side. Right? I just put a T for tibial, F for fibular, obviously left and right leg respectively. And our plantar branches, or the plantar nerve, will be found at the bottom of the foot. Makes sense. Recognize the nerves on your real anatomy. Recognize the nerves on the pictures with the labels from your textbook, and recognize the nerves on the models. I like to ask you questions on the models because they're a little bit easier to see, and we just covered them, obviously. And you should know in general where your nerves are. To recap, these are all spinal nerves. Every one of these nerves carries sensory messages and motor messages. All the sensory messages are going towards the central nervous system, and all the motor messages are coming away. Most of those motor messages will innervate a muscle. And we have 6 basic histology slides, and then we're going to wrap it up with some gross anatomy. I'll show you the slides, but obviously that's for you to study when you do your real anatomy homework. And I tell you what the slides are in order and what I want you to know. So I'll highlight some of the things. Slide number 1, and I didn't put 1 on it, but it correlates with number 1, is a motor neuron. You should be able to recognize it. Like it right. We can see it has a cell body, it has a nucleus, it has these dendritic processes coming off, and obviously a very long axon. In addition, like we talked about in lecture, hopefully, you'll see that there's some of these glial cells or satellite cells surrounding that neuron, and that's what all those little nuclei are off to the side. Makes sense. Here we have a nerve. This is how I started off way back when I started this lecture, right? So this is our nerve. It's the cross section of a nerve. If you had the nerve and you sliced it across and you look in it, this is what it would look like. The key things here, this is a nerve. And all of these little things are axons of neurons. The nerve is made of a bunch of little neurons, right? So this is just showing you the difference between the nerve and all those little neurons that it makes up. This is looking at a specific neuron. This is the axon coming through here. And I like this slide because it's pretty clear. You can see that there is myelin. All of this white stuff is myelin. So it's just a zoomed in version showing you the node of Ranvier. The node of Ranvier is, pick a good color, that little gap right there. Obviously, the stuff I have scribbled in orange is the myelin, and that red thing running through the center, respectively, is your axon. And again, you go back to here, axon with node of Ranvier, blah, blah, blah. The next slide will be your spinal cord. You'll see this in real anatomy. I showed it to you for plenty of time today. You can recognize the anterior horn, the posterior horn, the gray commissure, the central canal. We know our anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. We know the areas of white matter. And you're pretty good. Same thing here, right? This is the front, anterior median fissure, anterior horns, posterior horns, lateral horns, gray commissure. You can't really see posterior median sulcus, but it's back there. And respectively, all of your white matter. So if you know the spinal cord, you know the spinal cord. And the last one, this is what we call anybody took AMP here, AMP1, has clearly gone over muscle synapses and things. But what this is a slide of, because it's the nervous system, and we talked about that synaptic knob, this is the neuromuscular junction. So this is a picture where our motor neuron comes down and innervates. This is our motor neuron. our skeletal muscle. All of these are skeletal muscle fibers. But what's happening here is that motor neuron sending a message, making that muscle contract, right? It's obviously going to release some chemicals. That's a horrible color. Chemicals and things, neurotransmitters, etc. you talk about. So this is just a histology slide of the neuromuscular junction. And you should be familiar with the motor neuron and respectively the muscle fiber it is sending a message to. And then it contracts. And this is more of a review for you. Obviously, you have your real anatomy and stuff like that. But we have some gross anatomy pictures. Totally ask you. All this stuff is labeled. We already saw this on the first slide today, as far as histology of a motor neuron. This is another picture, just slightly different, higher resolution, pulled off the real anatomy. So you can see the epineurium, you can see those little axons inside, and obviously this is a nerve. Another breakdown of the spinal cord, right? On this picture, just in case it was confusing, this is your front, anterior median fissure, anterior horns, posterior horns, etc. And you have access to this, so you can kind of flip through. This is spinal cord. This is our posterior horns. Not the best picture. And anterior horns, respectively. And obviously, this is your spinal cord. You can see those branches coming off. Real anatomy, cauda equina, right? You have posterior roots, respectively. You have ventral roots, also known as anterior roots. Just a picture of the spinal cord, and you can see those spinal nerves branching off. We have some real anatomy pictures of the various nerves. Everything's labeled for you. Axillary nerve, obviously you utilize your real anatomy to study the stuff, so you can do your homework, and maybe I put some of those questions on your tests. Axillary nerve, clearly armpit. Brachial nerve, I don't really, it's brachial artery. You don't have to worry about that because we're not doing arteries, so don't stress about that. We can see the brachial plexus, musculocutaneous nerve, radial and ulnar. Again, I really like to ask you them in their respective areas, but this is a good picture to see the brachial plexus. Femoral nerve, right? Obviously, it's going to be branching off that lumbar region. Fibular nerve, always going to be towards the lateral side. You can see it coming over here. Obturator nerve, not the best picture, but that's kind of in by your adductor muscles by the inside of your hip and reproductive structures. Peroneals, also known as the fibular, so you don't have to stress about that. You don't have to worry about the artery. Sciatic nerve, this is a good picture. We're looking at the posterior view, and you can see that this big nerve comes down, kind of runs by your glutes, and it's going to run down the posterior aspect of the leg, branching off respectively into other nerves. Tibial nerve, we could see here, you can see how it comes towards the middle, branching off the sciatic nerve. Right? It's your sciatic nerve. And that's the gist. So, Lab 3 done. Key things: know the parts of your neurons, which we've already covered in lecture. Know the parts of the spinal cord. So for some of you guys, it's probably pretty easy. Know a couple histology slides and know your nerves, right? Be able to recognize the various nerves on both gross anatomy pictures and the model pictures that I show. You don't necessarily have to know exactly where they innervate and all this stuff. We'll go into that in future sections when we talk about reflexes and things. But other than that, Lab 3 complete. Good job. Make sure you get your homework done. I'll see you for Lab 4.